The piano had long gone quiet in Oakhart's saloon, though its keys still bore the smudges of desperate hands and spilled whiskey. In the lamplight haze, the place reeked of stale cigars and men who hadn't seen the inside of a church in years. There was laughter, sure, but it was the kind that cut like a razor, not the kind that healed a wounded soul. I stepped through the saloon doors, not looking for fleeting women, nor burning whiskey, nor fleeting company. I'd come to settle a grain delivery, to nod my head, collect my coin, and vanish back to the comforting silence of my homestead. That was all. The evening had pressed down with the weight of ghosts, and I hadn't spoken a word since breakfast. But then I saw them, 3 figures lined up near the bar's back wall, half-lit like specters at judgment. The first was young, couldn't have been more than 19, swathed in a yellowing wedding dress that had never quite fit her slender shoulders. Her arms were marred with small blistered welts, like she'd leaned over too many roaring stoves. She stared at her own worn shoes, as if they held the answers she dared not speak. Next to her stood a broad-shouldered woman with russet hair, arms folded like a seasoned soldier guarding her own deep hurt. The lace on her gown strained at the seams, and a few crude guffaws rippled through the men when they saw her, but she did not laugh. She stared at the rough floorboards like she was memorizing every knot in the wood, every imperfection. And then the last woman, stood like she didn't belong there at all. She held her chin high, the left side of her face shrouded in shadow. But when she turned, I saw it. Her left eye was clouded white like a full moon hidden behind storm-laden glass. The rest of her was composed, proud even. A former schoolteacher, perhaps, judging by the straightness of her spine and the way she didn't avert her gaze from any man in the room. They were not speaking. They were not smiling. They were waiting. I knew this wasn't a dance and this wasn't marriage. This was shame being sold by the hour. Malachi Crow, the saloon keeper, was wiping a mug with a dirty rag, calling out bids like he was selling livestock. Who will start us off for the blonde one? A bit shy, but she'll warm to kindness. Someone laughed, a coarse guttural sound. Another voice offered half a jug of rye and a knight's favor. The crowd roared with approval. I didn't move. My boots remained planted in the sawdust, but something in me went cold, a chilling memory rising unbidden. My wife Anna, before the wasting sickness, before she bled out alone while the doctor took too long to arrive. She'd been rejected by 3 suitors before me, told she was too skinny, too plain, too serious. I'd loved her for every one of those reasons. Now here were 3 women with those same labels stitched to their backs like damning crimes. The youngest flinched visibly when a man reached toward her face just to check the teeth as he joked. I stepped forward, then silent as the fog that sometimes rolled in from the plains. I didn't look at the men. I looked only at Oakhart and said, calm and low, I'll take all 3. The laughter paused, a sudden jarring silence. Someone coughed awkwardly. Oakhart blinked, his eyes widening. All 3. You drunk already, Elijah? Sometimes the most courageous act is not to fight or to repair, but simply to create space. To heal, to preserve dignity, to let others reclaim what has been stolen. Elijah's quiet strength reminds us that we don't have to save the world to make a difference. Sometimes just providing a place of peace is enough. In a noisy and judgmental world, kindness is often the only way to protest. For those who have weathered the storms of life, perhaps the lesson here is this: grace grows best in silence. And sometimes the most profound legacy we leave behind is simply making others feel seen. I reached inside my coat and laid down a handful of coins, clean silver, hard-earned, the kind that didn't make noise when it hit the bar. It just sat there solid like a promise. They're not cattle, Silas, I said, my voice quiet but firm. They'll come with me. One of the men, young, red-faced, and seething with anger at the disruption, spat near my boots. What are you planning, Vance? Build your own little church? I didn't answer. I just stepped to the side and opened the saloon door. The storm hadn't fully started, but the air outside was thick with the promise of rain. For a second, no one moved. Then the proud one, the schoolteacher, stepped out first. She didn't look at me, only passed me like a wind through dry grass. The broad-shouldered woman followed her movements, purposeful. And lastly, the girl in yellow, still clutching her burned arms, stumbled forward like she was waiting for someone to stop her. No one did. They vanished into the encroaching night, their dresses dragging behind them like old, heavy stories. I walked them to my wagon in silence. The horses stomped restlessly, unsure what was changing, only that something profound was in the air. None of the women asked where they were going. I didn't offer. The ride was long and quiet. Mercy, the girl, eventually fell asleep, her head resting against the sideboard of the wagon. May, the strong-shouldered woman, sat upright, staring into the dark like it owed her something. Catherine, the one with the clouded eye, kept her hands folded in her lap as if in silent prayer. The moon broke through, once pale and crooked, casting eerie shadows. I glanced back at them, 3 women, all discarded, all stronger than they looked. And I didn't know if I was saving them or if they were in some profound way saving me. The cabin appeared just before dawn, plain wooden, with shutters loose and porch steps worn smooth by countless footsteps. A lantern burned in the window, faint and flickering. I helped no one down. I only unlocked the door and stepped aside. It ain't much, I said, my voice. A low rumble, but it's clean. Inside there was a hearth, 2 cots, and 1 long braided rug that had once been my wife's. Dust clung to the beams, dancing in the faint light. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was waiting. Catherine took the cot closest to the window. Hattie sat on the rug, stretching her back with a groan that echoed in the quiet space. Mercy stood by the door, not sure whether she belonged inside or not. I fetched water and bread and left it on the table. I didn't say goodnight, just took my hat off, nodded once, and stepped outside. I sat on the porch, the cold wind brushing my jaw. Behind me, a chair creaked. Catherine had joined me. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The horizon bled into soft gray. Morning was beginning, and with it something else. I didn't know the word for it yet, but it felt like hope. The sun rose quietly that morning, slipping over the hills like it too was uncertain whether it belonged. Its light fell across the weathered front porch of Caleb Shepherd's homestead, where 3 wedding dresses hung damp from the night fog, each one breathing steam into the chilled dawn. No one had spoken since they arrived. No introductions, no questions. Only the faint creak of floorboards and the sound of a fire coaxed to life before the sky had turned full gold. Mercy was the first to move. She stepped barefoot into the kitchen, her nightgown clinging to her small frame, hair still pinned in the tight bun someone else had fashioned. Her arms, scarred and faded, peeked out as she reached for a pan that looked heavier than her wrists could bear. She moved without noise, out of habit, not stealth. I watched her from the barn window as she cracked 2 eggs and stirred them without seasoning, as if expecting someone to snatch the spoon from her hands before she could finish. Hattie arose with a sigh that carried the sound of cracking joints. She pulled her hair back with twine and stepped outside, ignoring the biting cold. She found the axe and began chopping firewood, each strike clean, precise, deliberate. The sleeves of her borrowed shirt strained across her back, but she didn't stop. When I approached, she didn't look up. She only said, her voice rough but clear, "This fence of yours leans like it's given up," and went on splitting logs until sweat glazed her brow. Catherine remained inside her dress from the night before, folded neatly by the window. She wore a faded green blouse and a skirt one size too short, the hem brushing her calves like it remembered a different woman's legs. She was standing in front of a cracked mirror, brushing her hair methodically, every stroke the same length. Her cloudy left eye stared back at her, unflinching. I leaned against the doorframe and cleared my throat. Catherine met my gaze through the mirror. "You ain't gotta do anything," I said, my voice gentle. "Not unless you want to." Her voice was soft but firm. "Idle hands get gossiped about." I said nothing more. The house already felt different. It had once been a monument to absence. My wife's shawl still folded on the mantel, a child's wooden toy tucked under the bed. Now there was movement, quiet as it was. The kettle hissed, a broom whispered across the floor, and laughter brief and sharp came from the yard. Hattie had broken the axe handle. "Damn it," she muttered, half grinning, then winced as a splinter jabbed her thumb. Mercy rushed out with a cloth, but Hattie waved her off. "I've bled worse over stew pots." Still, she let the girl bind it. Mercy's hands trembled slightly, but Hattie didn't flinch. Behind them, I finished mending the fence boards, 1 nail at a time, the hammer tapping like distant hoofbeats. By midday, they had settled into a rhythm not unlike a truce. Catherine cleaned the shelves, dusted the windows, and read from a tattered book in the afternoons. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her words carried weight. Mercy baked flatbread in silence, humming tunelessly, lost in repetition. Hattie dragged buckets of water from the well and patched roof tiles, stubborn in her usefulness. She worked like she was proving someone wrong. The townsfolk, however, were less quiet. By evening, Agnes Whitfield had arrived at the ranch. She brought no basket, no excuse, just her wrinkled shawl and a look that had seen too many winters. "You know they're talking," she said to me as I stood on the porch oiling a lantern. "Calling you all kinds of fool. Saying you bought yourself 3 brides, 1 for each sin." I didn't look up. "Let 'em talk." Agnes Whitfield narrowed her eyes. "You got plans for them girls, Shepherd." "I got space," I said simply. "They needed it." Tanner studied me for a long moment, then turned her gaze to the figures inside. "May's the strong one. Cracked a boy's jaw once back in Tennessee. Mercy's not from here, some cook's daughter, I think. And Catherine, she used to teach until some fool threw boiling oil in her face during a church brawl. Called her a witch for knowing Latin." My jaw twitched, and yet the town still points at them, not the men who did it. Tanner snorted. "You think the wind don't carry old sins just because they're quiet? You're either their savior Elijah or their next mistake?" I met her eyes. "I'm not either." That night, Mercy placed bread and soup on the table. She didn't sit. Hattie brought a chair from the porch and dropped into it with a grunt, nodding once. Catherine waited until I took the first bite before she lifted her spoon. No one said grace, but there was a stillness in the room that felt like reverence. "Do you plan to marry any of us?" Catherine asked, suddenly her voice cutting through the quiet. I paused, mid-bite number. Mercy looked down at her lap, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Good, Catherine said, a hint of steel in her tone. We didn't come here to replace ghosts. No, I agreed. You came here to get away from men like Oakart. That's enough. For a moment no one moved. Then Hada leaned back in her chair, tilted it on two legs, and said, Well, long as we know where the lines are, I suppose we'll all sleep easier. Outside, the wind picked up. I stepped onto the porch again. Hattie followed, carrying a broken piece of fence wood and a carving knife. She sat on the steps and began to whittle without comment. You don't trust easy, I said. Hattie snorted. You do. I looked toward the moon, pale and distant. Did once. She carved in silence. Then you think you're saving us. But maybe you're just lonely. I am, I said. That doesn't mean I'm wrong. The moon shifted behind a cloud. The cold deepened. You know, Hattie said, her voice lower now, almost a whisper. I grew up thinking I'd marry some blacksmith or farmer. Didn't count on being told I was too much. Too tall, too loud, too much woman for one man to manage. They meant it like an insult. But I held on to it like a badge. I turned to her. Maybe you weren't too much. Maybe they were too little. She looked at me then, full on her eyes, catching the lantern light. Maybe. Inside, Mercy watched from the window, her face half-lit, one hand resting against the glass like she was remembering something. Catherine was reading again aloud, this time to no one in particular. Her voice was soft, steady, full of rhythm. The book was worn, and the page she lingered on mentioned redemption. Later I would sit alone by the fire, listening to the house breathe. I would not yet know their stories, not fully, but I could feel them unfolding like seeds warming in the earth. They weren't my brides. They weren't my burden. They were people. Shadows, yes, but not ones I feared. I remembered something my mother once said long before her voice faded from memory. You don't need to fix the whole world, Elijah. Just give someone a place to rest a while. And here in a house that had once known only silence and sorrow, 3 women began to breathe again. Not because I saved them, but because I didn't try to own them. And that in the end made all the difference. The wind changed on the 3rd day. It came in low and dry from the canyon, brushing across the ranch like a stranger come to test the strength of doors and bones alike. The morning started as any other, Mercy tending to the hens, Hattie sharpening tools, Catherine reading beside the window, tracing every word with her finger like she was relearning the rhythm of language. I watched them from a distance, careful not to press too close. But something had shifted. There was tension now, woven into the air like a thread pulling tight. That afternoon, Mercy dropped a plate when she heard footsteps near the gate. Her hands flew to her chest as if to hold her ribs in place, her eyes wide and far away. The others ran in at the sound, but she shook her head before they could speak. It was nothing, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Just the wind. It wasn't. A man had come riding down the path, not a lawman, not a neighbor. I recognized him from the saloon. A thick-shouldered brute with a sneer that didn't move when he smiled. His name was Wade Colton, a ranch hand who'd drunk too much the night of the auction and placed a mock bid on May. He hadn't been laughed out for it. He'd left on his own, red-faced and snarling. Now he stood at the edge of my land, hand on his belt, waiting like the land owed him something. I stepped down from the porch. You're not welcome here. Clay spat in the dirt. Ain't here for you. You won't get past me. I got a claim, Clay said, his voice oily. Paid for her fair and square. Hattie stepped out, then barefoot, her face streaked with dust and sweat. She stood beside me but didn't speak. Her hands were steady, her gaze fixed. You got nothing, she said, her voice surprisingly strong. You offered a bottle of rye and a joke. That ain't a claim. Clay smirked. You think you're too good for me now. I was always too good for you, she said, quiet as thunder. Clay shifted his stance as if readying for something, but I didn't move. I just stood, arms loose at my side, eyes steady. That's when Clay noticed the rifle resting against the porch post. Uncorked, untouched, but undeniably present. You can ride off, I said, my voice even. Or you can limp off. But either way, you're leaving. Clay laughed once sharp and mean, then turned his horse. He didn't ride fast. Men like him never did. They wanted me to know they might come back. The silence that followed was thick. Hattie didn't flinch. She walked back inside, poured a glass of water, and sat at the table. Mercy waited until nightfall to ask what happens when the next man comes. No one answered. That night, we all stayed closer to the fire. Hattie sharpened the same knife over and over. Catherine pretended to read but never turned the page. Mercy kept glancing toward the door. I sat with my back to the window, watching the shadows move. Later, after the others had gone to bed, I found Hattie sitting out by the barn. You did good today, I said. She shrugged. I didn't do nothing. You stood your ground. She looked up at the sky. It never ends, does it? The proving, the fending off, even when you've done everything right. I didn't answer. Instead, I sat beside her, both of us facing the prairie as if waiting for it to offer something back. I've got nothing but this land, I said after a long silence. It's all I know. I plant things, fix things, keep things going. I don't know how to fix people. You're not supposed to, she said, her voice soft. Just don't break us more. I nodded slowly. That was all she wanted. No miracles, no mending, just no more hurt. By morning, Catherine had decided to teach again. The neighbor's boy Simon had knocked with a sheepish grin and a book in his hand. Pa says I can't read for beans, he mumbled, and Ma says you used to be real smart. Catherine had blinked stunned, but she invited him in and took the book, her hand trembling slightly. For the first time, she didn't sit by the window. She sat at the table, her clouded eyes softened by sunlight. She didn't smile much, but that morning she did just once. I saw it. And Mercy surprised us all. She asked to go into town. No one pushed her, but when she said it, she stood taller, like it mattered. Just for sugar, she added quickly, maybe flour. Hattie offered to go with her. Catherine said she'd write a list. I told them to be back before sundown, but Mercy said I want to go alone. So she did. She wore a scarf and a gray shawl. She kept her hands in her sleeves, but she walked with purpose. And though her fingers shook when she handed the coin to the grocer, she looked him in the eye. People stared, they always did. Some whispered. Some crossed the street. Agnes Whitfield, sweeping her porch, simply nodded. Mercy nodded back. She returned before the sky turned gold. I was mending tack in the barn. She walked straight to me and held out the sack of flour. I didn't say anything, just took it and handed her a folded napkin. What's this? She asked, her voice small. Apple jam, I said. You forgot it. She blinked, tears catching her lower lashes. I didn't mean to cry, she said softly. I know. The next few days passed without storm, but with a quiet change. Simon returned for lessons. Hattie repaired the hinges on the pantry door without being asked. Catherine began humming again, a low, tuneless melody. Mercy planted seeds in the windowsill box. Basil thyme, a few mystery sprouts she'd saved from old kitchens. The ranch began to resemble something like a home. Not perfect, not whole, but breathing. Then came the sheriff. He arrived one morning, boots thick, with red dust hat too clean for a man who claimed to know struggle. I met him at the gate. Words come from Oakhart, the sheriff said, his voice flat. Says there's some legal issue with your guests. Oakhart sold what wasn't his, I replied, my jaw set. Maybe the sheriff allowed, but his gaze was unwavering. But the town's uneasy. Preacher says it ain't natural. 3 women unmarried living under one roof with a man who ain't kin. I crossed my arms. They're free people. That Hatibi, but freedom makes folks nervous. The sheriff gave no direct threat, just a warning. Then he rode off, leaving a trail of suspicion behind him. That evening I told the women. May's jaw set. They think we're his still. Catherine nodded. Freedom's always looked like danger to small minds. Mercy didn't speak, but later, when the wind picked up and the house settled into shadows, she sat beside me on the porch, cradling a blanket in her lap like it held all her memories. I was never free, she said, her voice thin. Not really. Kitchen to kitchen, hand to hand, always someone deciding what I was worth. I didn't look at her, just stared out into the wind. Do you feel free now? I asked. She thought for a long time. I don't know. But I feel seen. In the distance, coyotes cried. The wind carried their song across the plains like a haunting hymn. I closed my eyes and let the sound pass through me. Inside, Catherine was lighting the lamp. Hattie stirred something thick and fragrant on the stove. And for one flicker of a moment, the world felt like it was tilting toward grace. Rain came hard that Sunday morning. It wasn't the kind of drizzle that whispered against rooftops. It pounded the windows like judgment, the kind of storm folks said God sent when he was watching close. Thunder rolled low across the plains, not angry, just steady like a drum beat before a reckoning. Inside the cabin, the fire had gone out. The air smelled of damp cotton and boiled beans, and Catherine was wringing out Mercy's dress by the hearth while Hetty dried her boots near the stove. I hadn't spoken much since sunrise. I sat at the table sharpening my knife, the rasp of metal on stone the only voice in the room. Mercy had stayed up late baking biscuits, something sweet for once. The kitchen still smelled faintly of clove and burnt sugar, though no one had eaten much. There had been a knock before dawn, not urgent, not loud, just polite enough to carry menace. Marshal Hayes stood outside with 2 others, his deputy, and a man I didn't recognize, tall and thin with a mustache too neat for any honest work. Behind them waited a covered wagon tarp flapping in the wind. Got some paperwork, the sheriff said, his voice devoid of warmth. You ought to read it. I didn't take it. What's the charge? No charge, the stranger chimed in, his voice syrupy. Just a matter of clarification. Ownership dispute, technically speaking. I looked past him. Oakhart sent you. Oakhart filed a claim, the man continued undeterred. Says these women were contractually bound to certain debts. He's willing to forgive him, the man added, if they return voluntarily. We don't want trouble, Shepherd, just resolution. Hattie stepped into the doorway, her presence commanding. We ain't contracts, we're people. The man tipped his hat but didn't meet her eyes. Doesn't change the records. You think a bottle of whiskey and a laugh count as legal tender? Catherine asked from behind me, her voice sharp with disbelief. The man blinked. Well, let the court decide that. Mercy stayed inside, but she stood behind the window, her hands twisted in her apron. Her breathing was shallow fast. I stepped down into the mud. They're not going anywhere. The sheriff sighed. Elijah, don't make this harder. Town's talking. Church folks say it's immoral. 3 women unmarried sharing a home with a widowed man. You know how that sounds. I know how it looks, I said, my voice like gravel. Like decency. You're going to stir up trouble. I didn't stir it, I countered, my gaze firm. I sheltered it. The rain hit harder, then soaking through jackets, through hair, through hope. The sheriff muttered something I didn't catch, and the wagon turned without a word. They left the papers on the fence post, weighted with a stone. After they left, Catherine read the documents in full, her good eye skimming fast, lips tight. They're trying to scare us. Legal nonsense stitched together with threats. Hattie lit a match off the stove and held it to the edge of the papers. Let him send more. The flames curled the parchment slowly. Catherine watched until the last ash fell. But fear doesn't burn as easy. That afternoon, whispers turned into words. Townsfolk passing through the ranch road slowed their wagons. A boy threw a stone and ran. Someone painted the word shame on the water barrel with pig's blood. Mercy found it first. She scrubbed until her knuckles bled. Agnes Whitfield arrived after sundown, soaked and out of breath. They're calling a council, she said, her voice shaking. Church elders, shopkeepers, all of them. They're meeting in the chapel tomorrow night, going to decide whether you ought to stay. Whether they ought to. Catherine didn't flinch. Let 'em. Hattie looked at me. If we leave now, we can outrun the worst of it. I shook my head. You don't run from a fire you didn't start. Mercy sat at the kitchen table, eyes wide, silent. That night I walked the fence line with a lantern. Rain had stopped, but the wind lingered. I saw it then, a figure near the tree line watching. A shape that slipped away before I could call out. I didn't chase. Just stood there, heart slow, hands steady. They were testing me. Testing them. The following evening, the chapel filled before the bell even rang. I arrived late, hat in hand, boots muddy but back straight. I walked in alone. The room fell silent. At the front stood Reverend Hiram Tate, gray-bearded, sunken-eyed, his voice like dry leaves. The sheriff sat near him. Oakhart wasn't there, but his men were. Store owners' wives with pursed lips, boys with stones in their pockets. You're here to defend your conduct, Mr. Shepherd. The pastor began, his tone accusatory. 3 women, no ceremony, no kinship, living under your roof. The Lord frowns on impropriety. Is kindness now improper? I asked, my voice steady. There are rules. There are people, he said. You all watched them get sold like meat. Not one of you stopped it. I did. A murmur rose. Someone scoffed. Someone else muttered sin. I raised my voice, then not loud but clear. I never touched them. Never claimed them. Just gave them room to heal. That's more than this town ever gave. Catherine stepped through the doorway then, her voice ringing across the pews, full of a fierce dignity. You talk about sin, but turn your eyes from cruelty. You call us fallen, but we're the ones who crawled out. Hattie followed, her shoulders broad, her gaze unyielding. We built that ranch with work and silence. No man laid a hand on us. We're not your scandal. We're your shame. Then Mercy, trembling, entered last. She didn't speak. She just held out her hands, red, cracked, raw from scrubbing. This is what we do, I said, when no one else spoke. When no one else does it, we survive. Reverend Hiram Tate faltered. A few heads turned. Agnes Whitfield rose in the back row and spoke for the first time, her voice firm. I remember when none of you would sit near me because my boy was born too dark. I remember what silence cost me. Elijah gave these girls what y'all never could. Peace. Someone tried to argue, but the words caught in their throat. After a long pause, the pastor folded his paper. There will be no formal judgment, but don't expect welcome. I nodded once. We never asked for it. I walked out. The women followed. No one clapped. No one spat. Just silence. A different kind this time. Back at the ranch, the lamps were already lit. Hattie opened the door. Catherine set the kettle on. Mercy swept the floor as if nothing had changed. But something had. Not everything needed to be declared out loud to be understood. That night we sat on the porch together. No words, just breath and wind and the steady creak of the swing. The storm had passed, but the air still held the scent of thunder. Catherine spoke once just before bed. They saw us. I nodded. They did. And they didn't blink. Good, Hattie said. Let their eyes sting for once. And Mercy, already halfway asleep in her chair, whispered, "We didn't come here to be loved, just to be left in peace." They hadn't been welcomed, but they also had not been run out. Sometimes in a town like that it was enough to stay. The wind came back not with a roar but with a whisper curling around the porch posts and eaves like a memory revisiting its home. It moved softly now, almost reverently, as if it too had been watching the little ranch with the same weary hope that hung between the rafters. Spring had crept in while no one was looking. The snow had melted weeks ago, but it was only now the land had begun to believe it. The earth outside the cabin was soft beneath my boots. The fence line stood straighter these days. The porch didn't creak quite so sadly. The basil Mercy planted had sprouted green, reaching for sun with the same kind of quiet defiance she carried in her shoulders now. Hattie had built a new pantry shelf perfectly leveled, no nails left over. Catherine had cleared out the broken piano keys and hung an oil lamp above the hearth where she read to Simon twice a week, her voice steady and warm. They had not been run out, they had not been embraced either, but they remained. And sometimes survival is the most profound rebellion. I had taken to rising early again, not because the work demanded it, but because I wanted to see the morning begin. I liked the way the light caught on Mercy's dress when she walked across the yard, the way Hattie sang now when she thought no one could hear, and the way Catherine sipped her coffee with one hand on her hip like a woman who'd chosen every inch of her own life. It did not speak of love, not aloud, but it crept in between gestures, coiled in the simple acts. A coat draped over shoulders before the night chill. Set in a shelf built without request, tea left steeping just the way Catherine liked it. Strong with honey. These things said more than declarations ever could. They were the language of people who had lost too much to gamble with words. Then just when we begun to believe the worst had passed, Ocart returned. It happened fast. A scream from the barn, a flash of orange against the night sky. Hattie burst through the front door shouting, "He's here, I didn't ask who." I already knew. The barn was alight, not fully engulfed, not yet, but flame licked the lower beams, hungry and spreading. Smoke poured upward like it had something to say. Ocart stood near the fence torch still in hand, his face twisted with fury and drink and whatever rot grew in men who lost power and couldn't bear it. "You stole them," he shouted over the fire's crackle. "Paraded them like saints while the whole town laughed at me." Mercy clutched the porch post, trembling. Catherine stepped forward. "Put it out," she said to me. "I'll keep her safe." But Hattie was already running bucket in hand, her hair whipping behind her like a banner. I followed, hauling water from the trough. We worked without speaking, sweat mixing with smoke, steam rising in clouds as we beat back the blaze. Twice the flames roared high enough to blind us. Once Hattie slipped and gashed her knee open on a broken rake. She didn't stop. Inside the house, Catherine held Mercy close, pressing a wet cloth to her mouth to block the smoke that snuck in beneath the door. Mercy whispered over and over, "Don't let him take us back." "He won't," Catherine said, her voice steady, not while I breathed. When the last of the fire hissed into wet ash, I turned to find Ocart gone. But he hadn't vanished. The man had circled behind the house. Catherine saw at first the glint of a blade, the crazed eyes, the sharp shaking breath of a man who'd convinced himself this was justice. He lunged toward Mercy and I was faster. I tackled Ocart into the dirt, years of grief and grit and restraint pouring out in every blow. The rage wasn't for this moment alone. It was for Anna, my wife, who had died without dignity, for every girl who had no place but a back room, or a bargain for every night this land swallowed sorrow without answer. Ocart bled not fatally, just enough to remember he was flesh fallible. Marshal Hayes arrived an hour later. Someone had seen the fire from town. No one asked questions this time. The sheriff took one look at Ocart tied and gagged in the wagon bed and said, "We'll be taking him far from here." No charges were filed against me. No sermons followed. Perhaps the town had finally learned to let silence rest in the right direction. The barn took damage, but it didn't fall. Hattie built the doors by the next week. Catherine taught Simon and two others how to read by lamplight. Mercy began sketching with charcoal on flour sacks, soft portraits of hands and wildflowers. The ranch lived, and in time so did we. Not as property, not as pity, but as people. On the first truly warm morning of the season, Mercy stepped onto the porch in a clean cotton dress and whispered to no one in particular, "I don't flinch when I hear boots anymore." Hattie answered from the yard, grinning, "That's 'cause yours are louder now." And Catherine, setting down her coffee, said, "Some scars stay, but they don't get the last word." I didn't say much. I just watched them, watched the way they moved through the space as if it were theirs. Because it was. Whether they stayed a year or forever didn't matter. I had not rescued them. I had simply made room. That evening, as the sun folded itself into the western ridge, the four of us sat on the porch. No one rushed to speak. We just breathed, each one knowing that the worst had already come and passed, and still we remained. The wind returned gentle now, not a storm, not a warning, just a witness. And I tell you now, if you ever ride past that stretch of prairie and see a porch lit with oil lamps and women laughing over fresh bread, tip your hat and keep riding. Not because you're unwelcome, but because peace doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just lives quietly in the places where grace was once made room to grow. That ranch will never be marked on maps, but the wind remembers.